Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about books. Today we're doing a February wrap-up, so I'll talk about what books I finished reading last month, and we'll do a mini March TBR. I don't do a ton of pre-planning, but there are a couple things that I do want to get to in March. But before we get started, a reminder, don't compare yourself to anybody else. Whether you read more books or fewer books than somebody else, it does not matter. What matters is that we're all reading, however much, and reading is winning. This month I read 8 books, a mix of physical books and ebooks, and that puts me a little bit ahead of schedule for my goal of reading 85 books this year, which actually kind of surprised me. I didn't think that I would get as many books finished, but I read a couple of short ones towards the end there. As I go through the list, I will do my best to call out content warnings, but as always, if there are any topics that you prefer to avoid for any reason, please do your own research. If I don't mention that topic, that doesn't mean it's not in there. So look after yourself. Mental health is the most important thing. The first book I read was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This book follows Mara, the third daughter in a royal family, who has watched first one sister and then the next marry an abusive prince, and she finally decides that she needs to do something about that. So she seeks out the help of a powerful witch to rescue her sister and take this prince down. Mara does not think of herself as a hero at all. She's just someone who wants to help her family and protect them. This book has a lot of fairy tale elements in it, which the author has changed around so that it feels familiar but also new, and I really liked that. It's also really beautifully written. For content warnings, this book does contain domestic violence and miscarriage and also murder, and other types of violence, so that's just something to be aware of going in. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, and T. Kingfisher is quickly becoming a new favorite author. Next, I read Chocolat by Joanne Harris. In this novel, a woman named Vianne Roche moves into a small town and opens up a chocolate shop, which may seem innocuous enough, but it happens to be right before Lent and in a very Catholic area. So she quickly finds herself at odds with the town priest, who seems like he will stop at nothing to get her to leave. This is beautifully written. I love the descriptions of the food in here, and it's got a magical realism aspect to it. This was a reread for me, and it's just as beautiful as I remember it, which is fantastic. It's always nice to come back to a book and enjoy it even more the second time. Content warnings for this one include religious intolerance, domestic violence, and murder. One thing also that I did not realize until I picked this up again is that this is actually the beginning of a series. I think when I read it, this was the only book out. And I could see myself reading more of Vianne's story. After that, I read a nonfiction book called Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. Montell is a linguist, and she has her own personal history with cults. Her father was actually a member of a cult as a teenager. So she has always had a fascination with cults and cult-like organizations and cultish language. So she brings it all together in this book, which explores not just organizations that I think most reasonable people would consider a cult, such as Jonestown, but also organizations that are not necessarily cults per se, but still use culty language, everything from exercise groups to corporate organizations. And she manages to talk about these different groups in a way that is not judgmental, but really tries to get at why someone would join an organization like that or stay in as long as some people do. And so she talks about the way that language reframes the way that we think about things and the way that we view the world. And it's really fascinating. Content warnings for this are probably not terribly surprising. There are academic descriptions of cult activity, historical descriptions. Montell also interviews people who have been members of those organizations, and they describe some of their experience. So there is violence, there is abuse, there is gaslighting described. Again, in more of an academic setting, but that could still be challenging for some readers, of course. So always look out for yourself. I really enjoyed this book and I've recommended it to a number of people already. Last month, I also read The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane by Catherine Howe. I had a lot of mixed feelings about this book, but let me tell you what it's about first. The main character, Connie, is a PhD candidate. She has, at the very beginning of the book, she passes her last qualifying exam to begin writing her thesis. And her subject matter is American colonialism. So as a PhD candidate, she has to find sources. She has to come up with an original idea, in so much as an original idea exists, but that's a whole separate conversation. The summer is just beginning, and so Connie's mother asks her to spend that time at her grandmother's house to clear it out. Her grandmother has passed away years before, and her mother never got around to dealing with the stuff. So since Connie is going to school near where her grandmother lived, she is tapped for this activity. In her grandmother's house, Connie finds evidence of a book of witchcraft by a woman, Deliverance Dane, who was ostensibly killed in the Salem witch trials, but who has never been documented. So she gets very excited from an academic standpoint because it's possible she has found a new Salem witch that no one ever knew about. Huge deal, of course, for her thesis. So she starts tracking this down, finds information, eventually finds the book itself. As Connie is doing this research, her academic advisor becomes intensely invested in her research and in her finding this book and starts to put a lot of pressure on her, which is a bit weird. And so she has to deal with that along with cleaning out a whole bunch of stuff from her grandmother's house, figuring out what's going on here, and getting ready to go back for the school year. And of course, there's a love story, because why not? I said at the beginning that I had mixed feelings about this book, and I really did. The premise is so interesting, and I liked a lot of the story. Part of this book is told in flashbacks about Deliverance Dane and some of her family, which is so interesting. I love that bit of historical fiction. But Connie herself, how shall I put this? She falls into the trap of a lot of highly educated people in that her intelligence is very narrow in scope. She's really smart about American colonialism. She's not so smart about other stuff. And so she definitely makes some decisions in this book that made me want to throw it across the room. For example, the grandmother's house has been empty or has been unoccupied, I should say, for 20 years, which is a whole thing in and of itself that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but 20 years. So we're talking dust, mold, all sorts of mess, that comes from a house just being unoccupied for so long. And Connie moves in to this house and spends the nights there from the beginning. And I'm thinking, what are you breathing in? You're sleeping on this bed that's got to be covered in dust. That's got to be so gross. And there's no description of her like changing the mattress or the bedding to make sure that, or sleeping on a sleeping bag or something. I know she's a college student, but still, it was just kind of gross. And so there's that. And there's some logical inconsistencies in here. For example, the house being empty, unoccupied for 20 years. What brings the mother to take action is that apparently the mother has also not been paying taxes on the property for 20 years. And the city is suddenly taking notice because, and I'll quote, a law changed. I'm not sure what law would have changed. I'm not a tax expert. I'll just say that. I do know you're supposed to pay your taxes. And I can't imagine what change in the law would make a town suddenly care about back taxes, 20 years worth of back taxes. That was a little weird. Connie also has this dog that she doesn't seem to remember most of the time. Ostensibly, she loves this dog, but she also doesn't really pay a lot of attention to it, but she doesn't neglect it exactly. That's a little weird. Yeah, there's just a lot of suspect things. And it also takes Connie much longer than it should to figure out some of the mysteries that are happening in this book, which in my opinion were a bit more telegraphed than they should have been. So the twists were good. I just saw them coming chapters ahead, and that annoys me a bit sometimes, but I did like the premise. So I'm very conflicted on this one. If it sounds interesting to you, I'd say go ahead and read it. I won't not recommend it, but it's also not going to be like my favorite book of the year. So this is also a series, and I don't know whether I would read the next one or not. If I found it like in the tiny library, I might pick it up like a free book, but I'm not going to seek it out either. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I did really like the end pages though, that have a spell written out for what to do when someone has been bewitched, which I thought was pretty cool. And that ends up being a plot point as well in the story. It's one of the spells in this book, the physic book, or book of witchcraft. So yeah, not exactly a disappointment, but not a delight either. Somewhere in between. You can't win them all. Editing peeps here, pardon the handheld. I realize that I got so caught up in my rant about the physic book of Deliverance Dane and how conflicted I was about it that I forgot to mention content warnings. So, there are some historical descriptions of the Salem witch trials, which of course includes religious intolerance and sexism and violence, both physical and sexual violence. There's also the general sexism in academia that is described in this book as well. So yeah, always look out for content warnings. Look after your mental health, and let's get back to the video. One book that was a delight though was Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Delight might not be the right word, but I did devour this book. It was so good. This is a thriller about Mallory Quinn, a recovering addict whose first job that she's been able to get out of rehab is as a nanny for this couple and for this couple's small son. It's a live-in position. They give her a shed to live on their property, basically a tiny house. Mallory instantly connects with her charge, Teddy, who is a sweet little boy, and they develop a routine during this trial period of the summer. And Mallory is hoping that she will be hired on full-time after that. But things start to get a little weird. Teddy, like basically all small children, loves to draw, but some of his drawings are a little creepy. And one thing about this book that was really well done is that some of Teddy's pictures are in the book. So you're reading and then suddenly, whoo, creepy child picture. Teddy draws his imaginary friend, a woman named Anya. But she is creepy as all get out. And when I saw that first picture, I thought, oh, he's drawing a ghost. No question in my mind, he's drawing a ghost. But I won't spoil it for you. There's of course a twist there. Mallory starts to get really concerned as Teddy gets more intensely connected to this imaginary friend, and even at times starts to seem afraid of her. And then his pictures start to change. And I'm gonna stop there so I don't spoil anything. But I really enjoyed this dynamic of Mallory being someone who needs this job. So your first thought might be, oh, well, quit, but she doesn't have other options. And she also, because she's a recovering addict, she can only say so much before people will think she's using again. And so it's really, she's in this tough spot where she wants to protect this child, but doesn't quite know how. I really liked it. And even though some things I saw coming, other things I did not. There were some nice twists in there. There was some good action. The pictures were so creepy. It's not a horror novel. It's sort of a horror novel. It's horror thriller. It's a little bit of both, but it definitely kept me on the edge of my seat, and I enjoyed it a lot. Content warnings for this one. Of course, I mentioned the main character is an addict, so there are descriptions of addiction. We delve into her background a little bit. And so there's abuse of drugs and alcohol. There's also some child abuse. There are discussions of mental illness, and of course, violence and murder, because thriller. Overall, I thought the book was really well done, and I do recommend it. I mentioned in my last video that I am in my cozy era for pretty much everything: books, video games, just my general environment. Love coziness right now. And I thought that I had read cozy fantasy, but I really hadn't until Coffee, Milk, and Spider Silk by Coyote J.M. Edwards. This is probably the epitome of cozy fantasy in that it is all vibes and basically no plot. It's a novella, so it's on the shorter side, and it is about Gwen, who is a drider. Driders are half spider, half human. She has left her job in the city guard so that she can open a coffee shop. So this novella is about a woman in a fantasy setting opening a coffee shop, and the trials and tribulations that come along with it, but they're not really trials and they're not really tribulations. You don't really worry a whole lot. Things go wrong. She runs into speed bumps, but it's all just very chill and cozy. And she has friends who help her along the way. She brings new friends in, and eventually, I don't think it's a spoiler to say, she makes a success of the place. So this is about 70 pages or so of the first month of this coffee shop. It is delightful. It is relaxing, and I did like it. I know that probably someone in the comments is going to say Legends and Lattes. I have it. I'm going to read it at some point soon. I think it's a similar concept, and I really like this. It's nice and chill. Sometimes you just need a chill book, and this is it. It's so chill, in fact, that I could not come up with a single content warning. I'm sure there is one, but I couldn't think of any. So there's my recommendation right there. If you watched my January wrap-up and mini February TBR, you will have seen me open the #1 Ladies Detective Agency by Alexander McCall Smith, which is a mystery set in Botswana. It's about a woman named Precious Ramatswe who starts Botswana's first female-led detective agency. This book has a series of mysteries within it as she is setting up her business and getting settled, finding clients, but also interacting with the people around her. I think I would call this a cozy mystery, but there are definitely some darker elements to it. Many of the mysteries in this book are a chapter or two long, and so they're pretty short. It's not quite a book of short stories, but it kind of reads like one. But then there are a couple of mysteries that span a couple of chapters, and so run in the background. And so there's a bit of that realism of she's not just taking one case at a time, but she actually has a couple of things going at once at times. And so I did enjoy that, because then she connects by seeking out one thing in one mystery, she connects the dots in another one. I do have a number of content warnings to call out for this one. There are scenes of domestic violence told in flashbacks, sexual violence told in flashbacks, and also miscarriage told in flashbacks. Those are all part of our main character's backstory, in an abusive marriage that she was in. There are also some instances of racism and sexism, and then there's also a story about kidnapping, the kidnapping of a child. So a few things to think about. While there are some lighthearted mysteries in here, there are also some serious storylines as well. So it's a good mix. And I would be entirely remiss if I did not mention that While this book is set in Africa and most of the characters are Black, the author himself is white, and I'm still putting my thoughts together on this, so I definitely welcome input in the comments. Alexander McCall Smith did grow up in Zimbabwe, and he lived for a time in Botswana, so he's not pulling this out of nowhere. He does have some experience of the cultures that he describes in the book. I definitely have seen some criticism that why is this white man writing from the perspective of a Black woman? I think that can be done well. I'm not in a position to say how well that was done here. I don't know enough about the culture of Botswana to say for sure whether this is a good representation. So I don't want to make a declaration on that, but I did do some Googling, some research, and tried to find some different perspectives. Candidly, most of the reviews and discussions that I found where I could get an idea of who the author was, those perspectives were mostly from white people. So not that that's an invalid perspective, but I would have loved to be able to find a little bit more from Black readers of this book. So definitely, I have more books in the series. I'm definitely interested in continuing to read it, but I also just want to call that out. And then the final book that I read in February is called Food Rules. It is by Michael Pollan. I'm going to do the content warning at the beginning because I can't avoid talking about it when describing the book. This book is about eating habits. So anyone with any kind of disordered eating or a difficult relationship with food, which many of us have, just approach this book and any book like it with caution. Look after yourself. I don't love the word rules as the title, actually for that reason that I think calling them rules is a bit prescriptive sounding. Let me tell you what this book's about. Michael Pollan is a journalist, and a lot of his writing has been about nutrition and the food industry and eating habits and cultural approaches to food. His claim to fame is that his food advice is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So you may have heard that phrase before. In this book, Pollan talks about the different ways to think about eating, about food, and our relationship to food. It's based in science and also draws on different traditions that different countries and different cultures have around food and how they eat and how they think about eating. And the base premise here is that pretty much any diet can be made healthy depending on how you approach what you're eating and when you're eating it and how you're eating it. One thing that Pollan also talks about in this book is that the science of nutrition is still relatively young, especially compared to other sciences. The way that our bodies process what we eat and differences in genetics and differences in the way the food is made or where it comes from, like those things are not fully understood. And yet we see so many articles, like I can't keep track. Is it okay to eat eggs? I can't keep track. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's got too much cholesterol, but it's got good cholesterol. And there's a lot of food like that. And if you try to follow all of the stories and follow all of the headlines, you will just not know what to do. And so Pollan breaks down the concept of choosing food in those three categories: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that's how the rules are broken up. So when he says eat food, he's talking about things that are actual food products instead of food-like products. And we all, especially if you are in the United States, we all eat things that are food-like products and not actual food. And so he has this emphasis on something that your great-grandmother would recognize as food. And not too much gets into how you're eating and how you're thinking about portions, but also eating at a table instead of in front of the television, eating because you're hungry, not because you're bored, things like that. And then mostly plants gets into how you choose what types of food to eat. He's not saying that everyone should become a vegetarian. Not everyone will want to, but a plant-based diet, even if it includes meat, is just healthier if you have more plants. And it also helps you avoid food that is not actual food. And so I really like this because it's very straightforward, and it's designed that while there are 60 something rules in here, you're not supposed to follow every single one of them. The idea is to make it easy to follow so that you're not standing in the grocery store aisle trying to compare these massive nutrition labels and ingredient lists. So I did enjoy this, and I do want to incorporate some of these into my own habits over time. So those are the 8 books that I read in February. I've got 2 books that I want to pick up in March. The first is Middlemarch. See what we did there? This has been on my shelf for a while, and Emmy and Carolyn Marie Reeds are reading this in March and April for the Game of Tomes read along, and so because I had it, I decided that I'm going to read it along with them. I haven't quite started it yet, but hopefully we'll get to this very soon. And then we have our March mystery book. So let's open that and see what we got. All right, we have The Murder Room by P.D. James. P.D. James is just a treasure when it comes to mystery. She's written a ton of books and always keeps you guessing. So I'm looking forward to this one. This should be a good one. And I cannot for the life of me remember if I've read this or not, because I've read a lot of her books, but I'll get back to you. So that's everything that I read in February and a few things that I'm planning to read in March. Let me know in the comments, have you read any of these books? And is there anything in particular that you're excited to read this month? And I'll see you in the next one.